The more you learn about the politics and especially the foreign policy of the United States, the more you see how extremely hypocritical it is, how the US government says something while doing the opposite. We saw one of the clearest examples of this hypocrisy this December when US President Donald Trump pardoned and released from prison one of the worst drug traffickers on earth, the former dictator of Honduras, named Juan Orlando Hernández. Now, when Juan Orlando Hernández was the dictator of Honduras from 2014 until 2022, he was a loyal right-wing U.S. ally who obediently served U.S. interests in Latin America and allowed the U.S. military to operate large military bases inside Honduras. Yet throughout this time, he was operating one of the largest drug trafficking operations on the planet. The U.S. government admitted this because even though Hernández was a loyal U.S. ally, he was flooding the U.S. with cocaine, which was, of course, exacerbating the drug crisis in the U.S. So the U.S. Department of Justice later convicted him and sentenced Hernández to 45 years in prison for distributing more than 400 tons of cocaine and also trafficking machine guns. The U.S. Department of Justice ruling noted that Hernández was, quote, at the center of one of the largest and most violent drug trafficking conspiracies in the world. His conspirators were armed with machine guns and destructive devices, including AK-47s and grenade launchers, which they used to protect their massive cocaine loads as they transited across Honduras on their way to the United States. And Hernández even worked with the notorious Mexican cartel leader El Chapo Guzman. El Chapo gave $1 million bribe to the brother of this Honduran dictator to get support from the Honduran regime. And while Hernández was trafficking all these drugs, he was a loyal U.S. ally, not only under Donald Trump, but also under Barack Obama and his vice president, Joe Biden, because U.S. imperialism in Latin America is completely bipartisan in U.S. politics. But during Donald Trump's first term as U.S. president, starting in 2017, Juan Orlando Hernández was a close U.S. ally, and in particular, Trump was using Honduras in order to put pressure on the left-wing Sandinista government in neighboring Nicaragua. And also in 2019, Honduras backed Donald Trump's coup attempt in Venezuela. And this shows how the hypocrisy is even more outrageous, because today, in 2025, Trump is waging a blatant war of aggression against Venezuela to try to overthrow Venezuela's government, continuing the failed coup attempt that Trump started during his first term as U.S. president back in 2019. And just as back then, Trump was allied with these drug trafficking dictators like Juan Orlando Hernández, today, Trump continues to support the worst drug traffickers in the region. He just released one of them from prison. Meanwhile, Trump is waging a war against Venezuela, which he claims is about stopping drug trafficking networks, in scare quotes, which at this point, you have to be a child to actually believe this nonsense. It is so patently ridiculous. It is an obvious lie. Yet the Trump administration has been bombing Venezuelan boats nonstop, including Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, previously known as the Secretary of Defense, although he renamed the Pentagon proudly as the Department of War. War Secretary Pete Hegseth oversaw double tap strikes on Venezuelans in these boats. So after the U.S. military bombed this boat, they then hit it another time to make sure there were no survivors. And by the way, there's no evidence whatsoever that these are drug traffickers in these boats. In many cases, they have simply been fishermen trying to make a living for their humble families. And yet the Trump administration is bombing them out of the water and then hitting them again to make sure there are no survivors. This is a blatant war crime against international law. And even if they were drug traffickers, by the way, the U.S. cannot just execute them like this without any charges or trial. These are foreigners in international waters. This is absolutely crazy. Yet the hypocrisy of the US government has become so blatant that even mainstream Western media outlets like the British newspaper The Guardian, which is very anti-Venezuela and is constantly publishing ridiculous propaganda about Venezuela, even they are now being forced to acknowledge that, as this headline says in an article, Trump's move to pardon Honduras's ex-president shows counter-drug effort is based on lies and hypocrisy. The entire world can see this. Trump claims he has to overthrow Venezuela's government supposedly to stop drug trafficking, which is a blatant lie. Meanwhile, he is pardoning and freeing the worst drug traffickers on earth. Now, to be fair, even an American journalist asked Trump about this to his face in the presidential plane. The journalist said, "If you claim that you want to stop drug trafficking, why did you release this notorious drug trafficker?" And Trump absurdly claimed that Juan Orlando Hernández was framed by the Biden administration, and the charges that he trafficked over 400 tons of cocaine were all manufactured for political reasons. Now, this is an absolutely hilarious lie because the investigation into Hernández's drug trafficking started during Trump's first term as U.S. president. In fact, back in 2019, the Associated Press reported that U.S. federal prosecutors accused Honduras's so-called president, its dictator, Juan Orlando Hernández, of using $1.5 million in drug trafficking proceeds to secure the presidency in 2013. So he stole the election with drug money. These were U.S. federal prosecutors saying this back when Trump was president in his first term. So this did not start under Joe Biden. This was not politically motivated. But listen to this clip here of Trump when he's asked about it. It is completely absurd.
You also pardoned the former president of Honduras, and he was released from prison
I
yesterday.
did. Well, he was the president, and they had some drugs being sold in their country, and because he was the president, they went after him. That was a Biden horrible witch hunt, which was, a lot of people in Honduras asked me to do that, and I did it. I feel very good about it. If you have some drug dealers in your country and you're the president, you don't necessarily put the president in jail for 45 years. That was a Biden-inspired witch hunt.
The inconvenient truth is that the narco-dictatorship in Honduras had bipartisan support from the U.S. government under Trump in his first term and under the Obama administration when Biden was also vice president. Both U.S. political parties supported this right-wing narco-dictatorship in Honduras because it served the interests of the U.S. empire in Latin America. And in fact, we cannot understand this history if we ignore the fact that in 2009, when Obama was U.S. president and when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, the U.S. backed a coup in Honduras against the democratically elected left-wing president, Manuel Zelaya. The military overthrew the elected left-wing president and put in power an unelected right-wing coup regime, and the U.S. government supported this. And this ironically fueled the immigration crisis in the U.S., because after the U.S.-backed coup in Honduras in 2009, the homicide rate in Honduras skyrocketed. Honduras became one of the most violent countries on earth, which led to a flood of immigrants and refugees, including children, fleeing Honduras and going north, seeking refuge because there is so much violence. Honduras, under the U.S.-backed narco-dictatorship, became one of the most violent countries on earth that wasn't at war. And then in 2013, the US-backed narco-dictator, Juan Orlando Hernández, stole the election with drug money, and he stole that election from the left-wing presidential candidate, Xiomara Castro, from the left-wing Libre Party. I'll come back to her in a minute here. But Hernández stole the election in 2013, and then he stole another election in 2017, and everyone knows he committed fraud. It was blatant fraud in broad daylight. And by the way, according to the Honduran constitution, a president is not eligible for re-election. There's a limit of just one presidential term. And yet this dictator had 2 terms, and the US government rubber-stamped his fake election that he stole. And by the way, the European Union also recognized this fake stolen election from this narco dictator, which shows how, the EU, which pretends to care about democracy and human rights, is just as hypocritical as the United States. Just the EU has slightly better marketing than Washington does. But the point that I'm stressing here is that the Western powers, especially the US government, have been meddling in Honduras for decades, in the case of the US for centuries. But in particular, in the past 20 years, the US government has repeatedly undermined Honduras's democracy and put in power corrupt puppets who were drug dealers. And we saw yet another example of this November, because on the 30th of November, 2025, Honduras had another election, which also was marred by very serious accusations of electoral fraud. And just a few days before that election, Trump publicly meddled in Honduras's internal affairs and meddled in its elections. And Trump went out in public and he endorsed the right-wing candidate Tito Asfura, who is from the right-wing National Party of, can you guess it, Juan Orlando Hernández. This is one of the most corrupt, drug cartel-linked parties on earth. Everyone knows they are drug dealers, and Trump publicly came out and endorsed them. And he said, quote, "The only real friend of freedom in Honduras is Tito Asfura. Tito and I can work together to fight the narco-communists," end quote. So Trump is insanely claiming that left-wing governments in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba are so-called narco-communists. There's no evidence whatsoever. These are the governments that have been fighting drug cartels, which are overwhelmingly working with right-wing corrupt oligarchs and millionaires and billionaires and big corporations. They're the ones attacking the left in many countries across Latin America. The drug cartels are allied with the big landlords and the oligarchs, the right-wingers, not the left. And yet Trump is proudly saying that the U.S. is going to support the drug dealers, the right-wing drug traffickers against the left in the name of fighting drugs. I mean, it is so absolutely crazy. Again, you have to be a child to believe this nonsense propaganda. But Trump said, quote, "I hope the people of Honduras vote for freedom and democracy and elect Tito Asfura president," end quote. So this is the Orwellian propaganda. Vote for the corrupt drug traffickers to support freedom and democracy. And after publicly campaigning for that right-wing candidate, Trump again meddled in Honduras' elections. On the 28th of November, he threatened Honduras. Listen to this message. Trump said, quote, "If Tito Asfura wins for president of Honduras because the United States has so much confidence in him, his policies, and what he'll do for the great people of Honduras, we will be very supportive. If he doesn't win, the United States will not be throwing good money after bad because a wrong leader can only bring catastrophic results to a country," end quote. This is a blatant threat by the most powerful country on earth, the United States, threatening the small country of Honduras, saying, if the people do not vote for this corrupt U.S. puppet linked to drug cartels, the U.S. will punish Honduras. There will be catastrophic results. But if the people elect this right-wing drug trafficker, then the U.S. will support Honduras. Trump said, quote, "The United States will work closely with him in order to ensure this success," end quote. And then he announced he would be releasing the notorious drug trafficker Juan Orlando Hernández. I mean, the message could not be any clearer. The U.S. government is publicly broadcasting to all of the drug traffickers and corrupt right-wing oligarchs in Latin America that they should steal elections and the U.S. government will support them. Donald Trump will give 100% support to these drug traffickers. And in fact, the left-wing presidential candidate in the Honduran elections, Risi Moncada, she and the left-wing Libre Party publicly came out and they alleged fraud yet again. After the U.S.-backed coup in 2009 and the stolen U.S.-backed fraudulent elections in 2013 and then again in 2017, now they're saying once again that there is fraud and they have presented some serious evidence. For instance, they showed that 2,859 vote tally sheets did not actually have biometric confirmation, which is required in Honduras. They represent roughly 25% of the overall votes. So these are votes that could potentially be fraudulent. Moreover, a member of the National Electoral Council of Honduras, which oversees the election results, an electoral counselor published video online showing how the results transmission system was changing the votes for some candidates and then giving them to the right-wing candidates to steal the election. These are videos posted by people working at the National Electoral Council. Now, earlier I mentioned the name Xiomara Castro and how in 2013, Juan Orlando Hernández, the US-backed drug lord, stole the election from her using drug money. Well, in 2021, the coup regime was so unpopular and so corrupt, it was falling apart, and it collapsed, and the US government imprisoned Hernández, its former ally, and finally, Xiomara Castro was allowed to win the first free and fair democratic election in a decade in Honduras. However, as soon as she came to power, the US government did everything it could to destabilize her left-wing government, especially because Honduras has been an ally of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And a month before the November 2025 elections, the president, Xiomara Castro, revealed that the government had obtained dozens of recordings showing how right-wing US-backed oligarchic groups in Honduras were conspiring to carry out fraud yet again to steal the elections. And according to the leaked recordings, they said that the strategy was to hack the transmission result system to change the votes, which is exactly what these videos from the National Electoral Council show, which is very strong evidence that once again there was fraud, just like there was fraud in the 2013 and 2017 elections that put in power this US-backed narco-dictator whom Trump just released from prison. I mean, it is just so blatant. It's in broad daylight. And I'm recording this video on the 3rd of December, 4 days after the Honduran elections. And there still is no official winner because the website of the National Electoral Council crashed. No one could actually see the results. And because two other candidates both claimed victory, including the Trump-backed right-wing candidate, Tito Asfura, and also the center-right candidate, Salvador Nasrallah, who is more closely linked to the U.S. Democratic Party, whereas Asfura is the candidate of the Republican Party. But they're both right-leaning, pro-U.S. candidates. And they both claim to supposedly have gotten around 40% of the vote, while they absurdly claim that supposedly the Libre Party, the left-wing anti-imperialist party of current President Xiomara Castro, supposedly got fewer than 20% of the votes, which makes no sense because independent polls done by foreign polling groups like the Mexico-based polling group Mitofsky, which was founded by a U.S. pollster, they found at the end of April 2025 that Xiomara Castro, the president of Honduras, had a 64% approval rating, and surveys done by the polling agency T Research found consistently from September until late October 2025 in the lead up to the election that between 44 and 49% of Hondurans said they were going to vote for the left-wing candidate, Rishi Moncada, from the Libre Party. And the right-wing Trump-backed candidate, Tito Asfura, only had 18% support, whereas the center-right candidate, Nasrallah, had support of between 27% and 30%. So the supposed results that cannot be independently verified because there are so many irregularities and the website crashed and the system was allegedly hacked, according to these reports, no one can verify these so-called results that claim that the left-wing candidate, who had support of nearly half the population, supposedly got fewer than 20% of the votes. It's completely absurd. Moreover, even if you don't believe the surveys done by polling agencies and you claim they have a political bias, well, you can look, for instance, at the website Polymarket. This is a betting website, and this website has been very accurate at predicting events in the short term, not in the long term, but surveys found that in the short term, it has a 94% accuracy. And why is that? It's because people around the world are putting money on the line. If they're wrong, they lose money. That's a very good incentive to be accurate. And also, it's a form of corruption, because what happens is you have people around the world in governments and institutions who have insider information, and they make bets based on that insider information. So if you look in the month leading up to the presidential election in Honduras, we saw that the left-wing candidate, Risi Moncada, and the center-right candidate, Salvador Nasrallah, were both neck and neck at about 40% of a likelihood of winning the election. And that was based on all of the polling done. Again, these are people who are putting money on the line, betting on this. Meanwhile, the Trump-backed right-wing candidate, Asfura, about 14% of people were betting that he would win the election. Again, this is based on the polls that were done. However, suddenly, on the day of the election, Asfura only had an 11% likelihood of winning, but out of nowhere, it shot up to 93% on the night of the election. And then suddenly, the likelihood of the left-wing candidate, Moncada, winning went down to nearly 0%. So what happened? Did people have insider knowledge? How did the candidate that went a month with having a very low percentage chance of winning suddenly go to being by far the most likely candidate to win, according to these betting markets, which have an over 90% accuracy in the short term? This is extremely suspicious. And again, when you look back at the very recent history of the US government backing a coup against Honduras' democratically elected left-wing president, Manuel Zelaya, in 2009, and then the US government backing the narco-dictatorship as it stole 2 elections in 2013 and 2017 with blatant fraud carried out in broad daylight, everyone in the world could see it. And then you look at what's happening in the 2025 elections when Trump is blatantly meddling and he releases the narco-dictator Hernandez from prison. I mean, you have to be a child to actually believe the narrative that is being sold to us from the US government. And the last thing that I'll say here before I conclude is, if you know anything about the history of US meddling in Latin America, of US imperialism, you know that the US government has backed dozens of right-wing coups across Latin America against democratically elected left-wing leaders in pretty much every country in Latin America. The US government has been the main enemy of democracy in Latin America and the global South for decades, propping up corrupt right-wing dictatorships and drug dealers. And Honduras is only the latest example of this. But what's so inspiring is the bravery of the people of Latin America and the bravery of the people of Honduras, a country that I have visited multiple times, and I've interviewed some of the victims of the US-backed coup in 2009, whose family members and friends lost their lives. And the democratically elected left-wing president, Manuel Zelaya, who was overthrown in the 2009 US-backed coup, he has been bravely speaking out and standing up for the sovereignty of his country. By the way, his wife, Xiomara Castro, is the democratically elected president of Honduras, whose left-wing party is now once again saying there was a US-backed fraud. And this is what Manuel Zelaya said, the president who was overthrown by the US. He said, with the interference of Donald Trump and his pardon of HO, that is J-O-H, that's the acronym typically used in Honduras to refer to Juan Orlando Hernández, HO. He said, with the interference of Donald Trump and his pardon of HO, the desperate bipartisanship imposes an electoral coup against Risi, which is the candidate, Risi Moncada, the left-wing candidate of the Libre Party. And when he says bipartisanship, he's referring to the 2 right-leaning pro-US parties, the National Party of Trump-backed candidate Asfura and the center-right Liberal Party of Nasrallah. But Zelaya pointed out that polls show that at the least, Xiomara Castro, the president, has the support of at least 55% of the population. And he said, quote, Trump, we are not intimidated by you. We have resisted coups d'etat, monumental frauds, political assassinations, and persecution. If we survive the narco-dictatorship, do you think a tweet of yours is going to break us? End quote. He then went on and said, quote, you can call us communists, socialists, insurgents, whatever you want. We are free Hondurans, and we fight for the self-determination of the peoples and for a dignified, just, and independent homeland. Neither Washington nor the oligarchy can decide for us. I think it's a very powerful note to end on, because here we talk a lot about geopolitics and international issues, but it's important to emphasize that the peoples of these countries are always fighting back against imperialism and defending their sovereignty. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.